Hello everyone and welcome back to the Finding Hope with Overcoming MS webinar series season 4. My name is Jake Connor and I am the Community Projects Officer at Overcoming MS, joining you from Manchester in the UK. Thank you so much for joining us on today's webinar, where we are delighted to be welcoming back Brett Drummond from MStranslate about the latest MS research and highlights from this year's ACTRIMS conference. So that's the European and Americas Committee for Treatment and Research in MS. We're also going to be catching up with CEO of Overcoming MS, Alex Holden, who also attended the conference, and Alex will be sharing some of her experiences and highlights in the latter part of today's webinar. And in a moment, I'll be welcoming Brett to the virtual stage for his presentation. But before I do that, I'm just going to run through a little bit of housekeeping to help keep the webinar running as smoothly as possible for you. So just to note that the session is being recorded and you will receive a link to access the recording and a copy of the presentation later in the week, along with a webinar transcript and key highlights. And you'll also notice that because this is a Zoom webinar, that there isn't an audio or video component for webinar participants. However, it's still an interactive session as you'll be able to ask a question using the Q&A tab on your screen. And if you do experience any technical problems, then we do recommend leaving the webinar room and re-entering using the link on your email. And for best results, we recommend using a Chrome browser to access the webinar, as it seems to work a little bit better that way. And we've tried to make the webinar sessions even more accessible. So today we're using closed captioning, which just look like small subtitles at the bottom of your screen. But you can take these off by clicking on the CC Live transcript button and selecting either show subtitles or hide subtitles. And finally, as you exit the webinar in 1 hour's time, there will be a short survey that pops up automatically that we would really appreciate your feedback on, as it helps us to shape future webinars and events going forward. So now, without further ado, I would love to welcome Brett to the virtual stage.
Thanks, Jake. Thanks for having me.
Hi, Brett. Thanks for being on our webinar today. How are you?
Good. It's nice and early in the morning here in Melbourne, in Australia, if the accent doesn't give it away where I'm calling in from. But yeah, really excited to do this presentation again and answer lots of interesting questions, I hope.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much for coming on to our webinar series again. You did present on a webinar last year from the 2022 conference.
Yeah.
But just for those who are hearing from you for the very first time, I think it'd be great if you could just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background.
I can indeed. Yeah. So I've got a few slides actually at the start around MStranslate. So I might, if you're happy, I can share those through and get started on it.
Brilliant, sounds good. I will stop sharing and disappear, and I will come back on the screen with Alex for a little bit of a discussion and a Q&A.
Perfect. Thanks, Jake. Share that through. All right, so hopefully everyone can see that now. Welcome to everyone that's calling in, and thanks for giving up your evening to hear me chat about the latest in MS research. As I said, I'm calling in from Melbourne in Australia. It's just gone 6 a.m. in the morning here, so I do encourage you to ask as many questions as you have, just in case, especially if some of the things that I'm saying aren't quite as clear as I wake up and try and make sense of all of this. But to start with, understanding that not everyone may have been on the webinar last year or may not know who MStranslate is, I just want to give a really quick introduction into who we are, then get into talking about the research that was discussed at the conference, and I want to try and leave as much time as possible for Q&A at the end to answer all of your questions. So we'll try and get through all of that. So MStranslate was actually formed just over 11 years ago now by myself and my brother Eric, who you can see on the screen here. So my background is actually in multiple sclerosis research. I did MS research for many years, but at the same time as I was doing my research, I was also getting a background in science communication, working with an Australian government agency that was based in the same building as my research lab. And I guess what had really struck me during my time doing research was how big a gap existed between people doing the research and people who were directly impacted by the research. And as a way of highlighting that, in the first decade that I was doing MS research, I really only had one opportunity across that time to talk to people living with MS about the work that I was doing. So I got to talk to Eric, whose background was in web and social media, about how we might be able to work together. And essentially the idea for MStranslate was formed. And really at its core, what MStranslate does is it uses my background in both MS research and science communication to update people on the latest in multiple sclerosis research in a way that's both accurate and easy to understand. And those two things don't necessarily always come together. We know that when things are shared through mainstream media, while it might be easy to understand, it sometimes lacks the accuracy that we're looking for because generally they haven't gone to look at the research directly. Or if it's shared in scientific journals, it may be accurate, but it's not necessarily easy to understand for people who don't have quite a large background in the research. So I don't want to go too much into what MStranslate is. Happy to answer questions about MStranslate at the end as well, or you can see it on last year's webinar. I talk a little bit more about who we are. That's our website, so you can find all of the articles that we write there and a lot of our videos and podcasts as well. And if you do want to connect with us at any point after the presentation, you can basically find us on all social media platforms. Just search for MStranslate. It's capital MS, lowercase translate, all one word. That should make it pretty easier to find all of our platforms. So with that little quick introduction, one of the things that I get to do as co-founder of MStranslate is go to the yearly conference, which this year is in Milan. I'm virtually taking myself back mentally to when I was in Milan from the conference with my background. This was just on the day before the conference started, getting to walk around and see the Duomo. So I'm going to pick out a number of highlights from this year's conference. And so I actually attend the conference with a bit of a dual hat, and I'll mention one of them at the end, but I'm there as co-founder of MStranslate, and we do daily summary reports back to our community about everything that we've heard at the meeting. And I was joined at this year's meeting by a couple of colleagues, Dr. Travis Stiles and Dr. Joanna Cobbin. But I am also the host of the official ECTRIMS podcast. And so we do podcasts through there with a number of keynote speakers, and I'll mention that again at the end. This year's meeting was actually called MS Milan 2023. The special name not being ECTRIMS was because this was actually, as Jake has already mentioned, this was a joint meeting. So every 3 years, the conference is a joint meeting between the European Committee and the American Committee. In between, it's just the European. They have separate meetings, but largely I attend the European meeting. And these meetings, as I think Alex will talk to a bit more about her experience at the end as well, but these are really huge meetings. There are around 9,000 people that attend, researchers, clinicians, other healthcare professionals, and other people from the MS community. And there are multiple sessions. So I'm just going to be talking about a few of the highlights that I was able to hear. Just to make you aware, there's around 9 sessions running at any one time, multiple sessions throughout a day across 3 days. So there's a lot of research being discussed. And really, I'm just going to be talking about the tip of the iceberg, but happy to try and answer other questions that you may have about other topics that I don't mention. And we'll see if we can talk through those as well. So I think probably one of the biggest discussions at this year's meeting was around genetics and progression. So just to provide a little bit of background on that, we've known for a long time that MS has a genetic component to it, but we know that it's not a classic genetic disease. There's not one thing that you can inherit from mum or dad that will determine whether or not you do or don't get MS. Research has shown that now there's more than 230 genes gene variants that have been identified that can contribute to MS susceptibility. So basically increasing your risk of developing MS. We know that the genetic component probably makes up around 50% of your risk of developing MS, and then the other 50% is made up of environmental factors. But up until this year, all of the genetic impact that we were aware of was related to the risk of developing MS. However, earlier this year, a really groundbreaking project was published. Don't worry about the title, the fancy scientific title there, but basically this was the first time that a genetic variant had been identified, which impacts on disease progression. And so they were able to, looking across a really large amount of genetic data, they were able to highlight this one specific genetic variant that was significant and had an impact on how quickly the disease progressed in a person living with multiple sclerosis. And I won't go through all of the data in that publication because there was a lot. It was quite an in-depth publication. But for example, they could find things around, individuals with this genetic variant were 4 times more likely, were more likely to reach an EDSS of 6, which is needing help with a walking aid 4 years quicker than someone who didn't have that genetic variant. And just as again, a bit of a background on genetics, for all of our genes, we get 1 gene from mum, 1 gene from dad. And if you had both of those copies with a genetic variant, then your time frame to reach those things was even quicker. So it was almost what we would call a dose-dependent effect. So this was really groundbreaking because this was the first time that we had any genetic information in terms of how it related to disease progression. And so this, basically every session that I sat in, regardless of what the theme of that session was, this talk or this publication was mentioned. And that's because it has some huge potential in terms of what it might mean for people living with MS. One of the key things that was discussed is around, is this going to be able to provide us with a better opportunity for prognosis? So, we may get to a point where we genetically screen individuals to see whether or not they have this genetic variant. And if so, that gives us some information that they may be at risk of progressing quicker. And so, treatment decisions, lifestyle decisions can be made with that information in mind. Having just recently recorded an ECTRIMS podcast episode with the 2 leading researchers on this paper, they're also quite confident that they think that this is just the tip of the iceberg and that other genetic variants will be identified that also link to progression. So I think this is really exciting research. I think it is quite groundbreaking in terms of what it is. And so it will really shape a little bit of some of the MS research landscape for a little while. So that, I think, was one of the big highlights of this year's meeting, was how many people were talking about that research. I want to talk a little bit about EBV, and I'm going to go through this, the majority of this slides quickly, and just talk about some of the new things that have happened more recently. I did talk about EBV on last year's webinar as well, so some of this will be a little bit of a repeat, and that's why I'll go through it quickly. Again, happy to answer questions on it. But EBV or Epstein-Barr virus is a virus that causes glandular fever or infectious mononucleosis, depending on what part of the world you're coming from. Although importantly, before we even get into discussing what the research has shown lately, it's important to realize that while this virus does cause glandular fever, most people who are exposed to the virus don't get glandular fever. Most people will get it and be completely asymptomatic. So when we talk about this, a lot of the questions I get say, well, that doesn't line up with my experience because I didn't have glandular fever. You may very well have been exposed to EBV and just never been aware of it. And so just to run through the timeline of what we've known about this virus. So when I started doing MS research, which is now 18 years ago that I was involved, we were talking about Epstein-Barr virus then, largely because the data we had showed that around 95% of people living with MS had been exposed to EBV, and it was only around 90% of the general population. So we could see that, yes, it was slightly higher in people living with MS, but it really seemed to be at the time that it was just a really prevalent virus that a lot of people are exposed to. So it's hard to make any real definitive links to that. The update that I provided last year is that that all sort of changed over the past couple of years when there was more conclusive evidence found around the link with EBV, and there was a couple of landmark studies that really showed this. But basically what the new data that came out was that they were now able to show that actually 100% of people living with MS in these two large studies had been exposed to the virus. And they were able to show in one of those in particular that was done in a cohort of US military personnel where they had blood samples from throughout their lives. They were able to show this really nice timeline where they could see they had blood samples from before the person was diagnosed with MS. And they were able to show that there was this nice timeline of not exposed to the virus completely fine, exposed to the virus at a certain point, and then after that is when they could start to detect some damage to the nerves being present in the blood via a test looking for neurofilament light, which is a biomarker that you may have heard about before when hearing about MS research. Basically, when damage to the nerves occurs, neurofilament light gets released into the blood. And so it's something that they can look at to see whether or not this nerve damage is occurring. So this time frame was really nice to show that there wasn't anything happening in those individuals until after they were exposed to the virus. So the thinking around then was that it seemed to be not the cause, because we know, around 90% of the population are exposed to EBV. Not 90% of the population don't develop MS, but it seemed to be that in the very, very vast majority of cases of MS, they couldn't occur unless a person had been exposed to this virus. Excitingly, trials were underway because there was some evidence to suggest that not only was it EBV involved in the development of MS, but might also be involved in the progression. So there are a couple of groups in Australia and in the US who will look at targeting EBV as a possible treatment option for people living with MS, because EBV is a virus that is never completely cleared from the body after exposure by the immune system. So these approaches were both looking at ways of being able to get in and completely clear it from the body, and would that work as a treatment. There has been updates just within the last week or two from the US group to say that their treatment hasn't met, its trial hasn't met its endpoints. So we wait to see on that. I think there's a little bit of thoughts that maybe there could be some reasons for that. So there may be still some cause for hope around that treatment approach, but we'll wait and see. But in terms of the future, with our understanding of this now, this is really one of the first times that I can certainly think of since I've been involved in MS research, where there's a cause for hope that potentially we could maybe have a future where we can prevent MS from occurring. And that would be through the development of an EBV vaccine. So places are already working on this. Moderna, who people may know of from the COVID vaccines, have started trialing an mRNA EBV vaccine, but that's still very early stages. And it's really important to sort of talk about this with a lot of context and understand that we're really just talking about it theoretically in terms of its potential to prevent MS, but also there are a large amount of difficulties in terms of creating EBV vaccines. This isn't the first time people have tried. So, we need to be able to get one first. And then there are still, even if we did have an effective vaccine, a lot of questions that we need to ask around, what's the timing of this? Will it actually be able to prevent MS? Are boosters needed? Lots of questions around there. But, potentially And hypothetically, we can see that that could be a way of preventing MS in the future. So one of the things that I found really exciting at this year's meeting and really interesting was the talk around the MS prodrome. So everyone can sort of think, I obviously won't be able to hear your responses at the moment, but I think most people living with MS that I talk to through my role at MStranslate would say that, there is this point where they were diagnosed with MS, but there was a reasonable period of time before that, after they were diagnosed, that they can say, well, that explains, the tingling in my hand that I had 6 months ago, or that explains, why my foot was going numb, or why my eyesight was going blurry. People have these anecdotal experiences of, understanding that something wasn't quite right before their diagnosis of MS. And this sort of follows on from the MS prodrome, sort of follows on from that, but looks quite a bit in advance. And so just to talk about how they do this research, just as one clear thing to talk about, often when they're looking at that window before, they're looking at 2 different time points. So they are looking at the time of diagnosis, but they're also looking before the time of MS symptom onset. And so that's that part that I'm talking about. So you get diagnosed and you say, well, actually, yes, 6 months ago, 12 months ago, my eyesight started to go blurry. And so that may be the time that they're looking before. They're looking before that start of onset as well. I'm just going to bring up this slide here to show this, but don't worry too much about all of the details. I'm just going to move myself over here. But hopefully you can see my marker. So here is this point here of symptom onset. So this isn't diagnosis. This is the point of you get diagnosed and then you explain when you think the first symptom that related to MS was. And what we're interested in, or what we're talking about, is this time here. And so often the window that they're looking at is sort of 5 years before that. And what they've found is that for people who go on to be diagnosed with MS, in that window of sort of 5 years before MS symptom onset, there are still a lot of things happening that sort of set them aside from the general population. They've shown that they have a more increased visits to psychiatrists, higher rates of depression and anxiety, higher rates of pain, higher rates of hospital visits, higher rates of visits to healthcare professionals, higher rates of fatigue, higher rates of headaches and migraines. So there's a lot of stuff happening even before MS symptom onset happens. And that's now what we're calling the prodromal phase. And so what they think, or what's sort of being hypothesized, is actually that MS starts here. So it's this disease initiation which leads to this phase of the MS prodrome. And then after that, some time point, then we get MS symptom onset. And so this is really interesting because, and for stuff I'm going to talk about in a sec, the earlier we can identify that a person is at risk of developing multiple sclerosis or has already developed multiple sclerosis, the better their long-term outcomes. Just as one other point in here that relates to progressive MS, the data that I found the most interesting throughout the whole conference is they can actually show in people with primary progressive MS looking a very long time before disease diagnosis and symptom onset, that there are cognitive issues. And so they looked at 30 years prior to diagnosis and saw that cognition between healthy individuals and people who went on to be diagnosed with primary progressive MS was the same. But at 20 years before, 20 years, they were able to start to see a difference in cognition. So people who went on to be diagnosed with primary progressive MS were already having issues with their cognition 20 years before the onset of MS. And then 10 years before was an even bigger gap between those people. So there was a lot of stuff happening. And if we think about these being times where we can start to maybe impact on the disease through a variety of methods, this becomes really important. So this for me was really interesting. And the reason why I say, and this is just a treatment slide, I think it's a good time to mention that my background is very much MS research. I'm not a clinician. So in terms of talking about anything clinical, I can do it from a research perspective, but I can't give sort of clinical advice. But one of the things that I think relates to what I just said, and there's been a debate for a while in MS, but I think is now sorted, is around treatment approaches and whether or not we should use an escalation approach or an induction approach. Just to explain what those terms mean. Escalation has sort of been the traditional way of going about it, where a person may start on a lower efficacy therapy, which might come with mild side effects. And then as their disease starts to get worse or they start to fail that treatment, then they'll get escalated up to a more powerful, and just you continue to build up to more powerful and powerful therapies. Versus induction, which is basically the idea of starting a person on the best available therapy that we can from the very beginning. There'd often been a bit of a hesitancy around doing that, because if you start a person on the best therapy and that fails, where do you go next? But now there is really consensus around, so this was a publication from a few years ago, but brain health time matters in multiple sclerosis, and this was one of the figures coming out of that. Again, don't worry too much about the details here. But this is looking at people with no treatment. This is disability level. As we go up here, this is time across here. We can see that for someone on no treatment, they'll reach a level of disability around here on average. If we get someone onto a highly effective therapy later, so a bit of a time after diagnosis before we get them on, their outcomes are better than no treatment at all. But you can see that the outcomes are the best for when we can get a person onto a highly effective therapy as early as possible. And there's lots of data now to show how much better the long-term outcomes are the earlier we can get someone on a highly effective therapy. And this then relates to what I was talking about with the MS prodrome and being able to understand from a very early time point, can we get this intervention even earlier in the process, and what would that mean for long-term outcomes, I think is interesting to think about. So obviously understanding the group here, lifestyle modifications, is something that we need to talk about. I think it's fantastic that it's now a really common part of these meetings, and there are sessions on exercise and diet and smoking and other lifestyle modifications. I'm happy to answer lots of questions on that, and I assume we will get them. But my actual takeaway from this is going to be quite brief and very similar to what I talked about last year, because I think now, while we're continuing to talk about this in the research space, the takeaway message at the moment really is that the best thing for people living with MS to do is just to live a healthy lifestyle. There is very much consensus that diet and exercise are important ways to manage MS, as well as other lifestyle modifications. I think that's pretty much agreed upon now. But in terms of the specifics of that, if we take diet, for example, really the take-home message at the moment is that while obviously at an individual level, some people may benefit from different types of diets, really across people living with MS, the best guidance that we can give is that a healthy, balanced diet is the best approach. And same with exercise. Different types of exercise may have benefits for different people, but really the idea is just that being able to build some exercise into that management plan is really important. So it's something that's being talked about a lot. Definitely something that there is now a real understanding that this is important in terms of helping to manage the MS, but the overall take-home message is generally the same as it would be to the general population, of just trying to ensure that we live a healthy lifestyle and build that in. As I said, happy to answer more questions around that if you do have them. So I think I'm doing pretty well for time, which surprises me slightly, but I've just got a couple of slides left, and one that I want to talk about that's a relatively new concept in MS is this idea of PIRA. So PIRA stands for Progression Independent of Relapse Activities. And so this is going to be a little bit complicated, but I'm just going to try and run you through this quickly. And again, if you have questions, certainly do ask them. So traditionally, this is how we would have viewed what MS looks like. So the majority of people, roughly around 90% of people when they're diagnosed, are diagnosed with relapsing or remitting MS. And we would say that this is what the disease course looks like, this sort of disability here on the y-axis. So you have these periods of relapse where there's disease worsening, and then they get a little bit better, remission, another relapse, disease worsening, never get quite back to how you were, but you get a little bit of recovery and then remission. And we know that that happens at different rates for different people. And then for the 10% of people who are diagnosed with primary progressive MS, or the people who go on to transition into secondary progressive MS, it's then a different phase where instead of having those periods of remission, we just have this increasing disability accrual over time happening. And the drivers of these two times are different. In the relapsing or remitting stage, it's inflammation that's the biggest issue, whereas in that progressive phase, it's neurodegeneration that's the bigger issue. As a side note, we are really getting away from using the terms relapsing or remitting, secondary progressive, primary progressive. I'm not going to talk about that now, but generally we're trying to avoid those terms because we think there are some issues with categorizing it like that. But so that's traditionally how we thought about it. More what we're thinking about now, and this is an even more confusing image, so don't worry too much. I'm just going to talk you through one real thing here. You can see here these steps again. This is our relapsing or remitting phase here happening. But what's happening in the background, and we can sort of see it by this light blue sphere, is that this part that we were talking about not happening until later in the disease, after the relapsing or remitting phase, we actually know is happening from the very beginning. And so there is this neurodegeneration component happening in the background from the very start. And the reason that's important is that really all of our current therapies are targeting this inflammatory component. And so aiming to stop disease through targeting inflammation, none of them really target neurodegeneration. And so now understanding that this is a problem from the very beginning and can impact on disease, even if we are effectively being able to target this part of it, with some now realization that we need to come up with ways to target neurodegeneration. Obviously, it's been something we've been trying to do anyway to help people living with progressive MS. It's a huge need because our therapies there are almost non-existent. But yeah, now even bigger, knowing that this is happening in the background is something that we need to go. And smoldering MS is the other name for PURE, and it was a big thing across this meeting. And so the last science part that I want to talk about is just remyelination or myelin repair. So following on from what I just talked about, with the fact that all of our existing therapies target that inflammatory component, what none of our existing therapies do is repair any of the damage. So they all work to try and stop new damage from occurring, but none of them repair damage that's already occurred. And so there is a lot of research around the world looking at trying to find an effective therapy to do that. Again, I think I showed this last year, but it is the biggest one that's probably happening at the moment. So trials using metformin happening at the University of Cambridge in the UK, based off some animal work. In the interest of time, I won't go through the background animal work, other than to say in a mouse model of MS, they did find that both metformin and intermittent fasting were able to promote improved myelin repair in those mice. And so now they are doing a trial underway with both metformin and clemistine, which is another a compound that's been found to potentially promote myelin repair. We expect probably to have the results of the sort of preliminary results of that trial towards the end of 2024, if not the start of 2025. There is a lot of other groups, just to talk about remyelination, there are a lot of other groups who are also working on it, which I think is really important and exciting, including Novaron Bioscience, who have just started some work underway here in Australia. And I said at this year's conference, Dr. Travis Stiles was with me, who is the CEO of Novaron Bioscience. They have their own remyelination therapy. But it's a thing where multiple avenues are being explored, and that's always a really positive thing, because the more avenues that we have, the more likely we are of getting a success. And to sort of explain how confident people are around this, I did a podcast episode with the two researchers from Cambridge who are running this trial. and asked them point blank, do you think we will get an effective therapy for remyelination for multiple sclerosis? And without hesitation, they both said yes, which is very unusual for scientists to answer questions like that. So I think, there is a real large amount of confidence, and hopefully that we will get something within the next 5 to 10 years for that. Just as a plug for the ECTRIMS podcast, as I said, this is the other thing that I do. So if you're also interested in hearing more highlights from the conference, there were daily episodes from MS Milan that I recorded. So with Stephen Hauser on day one, who gave the keynote lecture, Claire Walton, who some of you may know, who's the Director of Research at the MS Society UK, and then the ECTRIMS president as well. There's also episodes that come out roughly every 3 weeks with other people doing really interesting work in MS research who I interviewed. This was quite a weird experience for me, because actually when I first started doing MS research in 2005, I was reading papers written by Stephen Hauser, so it was weird to be sitting in a room getting to chat with him. But so feel free to listen to them as well. They're on all of your podcasting platforms. Some of the episodes may be slightly more technical, but there'll be lots there that I think will be interesting as well. So I've actually done much better than I thought I would with timing. So hopefully we have lots of time to answer some questions. But I think my takeaway message is that, the meeting this year in Milan was really exciting. Lots and lots happening in the world of MS research to be excited about. And from the start, obviously, hopefully you all now know who MStranslate are. Feel free to follow us across all of those platforms. And if you do have any questions about anything that I've said tonight that don't get covered during the Q&A, you can reach me by email there, or if you follow us on any of those social platforms, you can send us messages through those as well. And I'll make sure that I answer as quickly as possible. So thank you, everyone. I will stop sharing those slides and we can move to the Q&A.
Wow, thanks, Brett. That was great. A lot of information and highlights shared from the conference. So yeah, just a massive thank you. I'll give you a moment to take a breath. And also just to remind our audience that your slides will be available after this webinar as well for them to look back on. So thank you. So we now have our CEO of Overcoming MS, Alex Holden, joining us on the virtual call. So welcome, Alex. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Jake.
So Alex, you attended the conference, obviously representing the Overcoming MS charity. So just for our viewers, our audience, would you mind introducing yourself and just telling us a little bit about your experience as well at the conference?
Yeah, it's very interesting sort of hearing Brett talk about his experiences and his takeaways from the conference. So thank you, Brett. As a lot of our viewers will know, I've only been with Overcoming MS since March of this year. So going to ECTRIMS was a huge baptism of fire. And I think the team were quite jealous when I said that I was going to Milan for a few days. And then when I came back and explained what ECTRIMS was actually like, they've all refused to go or come in my suitcase or anything in future years. I guess for people watching the webinar who haven't been to this type of research conference, it's probably, I can sort of help you understand a bit what it's like. So that Brett said there's 9,000 people there. So some of those people are online, but the vast majority are there in person. And at one point it did feel like all 9,000 of them were on the escalator with me. There's queues to get in, there's queues to get on the escalator, queues to get off the escalator. It's impossible to find food or drink. It is the noise of 9,000 people, or probably about 7,000 people in one building, and all chatting, but the vibrancy and the energy of all of those different cultures, all of those different languages, and everybody who has anything to do with MS. I'm only just learning all the key neurologists, the key clinicians, the key researchers, and they were all there. At one point I did see Brett sort of in the distance walking down the corridor and tried to get towards him, but there was just no chance of catching up unless you arranged specific spots to meet people. So the timetable for the event is sort of a full packed day, and there's lots of informal meetings either at the beginning of the day or the end of the day. Then there's 9 different streams of different colours, which are sort of the different rooms where meetings are being held. So at any particular point of day, you could go to any one of 9 different events. And so you have to choose which presentations you want to go to. And so, for example, I might go to Healthy Lifestyle with MS, and that would be, say, from 1:30 till 4 in the brown room. But even within that, there would be 5 separate presentations within the one presentation, of which there are 9 to choose from at any time. So Brett's ability to have summed up the takeaways from the conference, whereas that sheer amount of content is an extremely impressive job. The value for me definitely was meeting an awful lot of people in person who I've had a lot of introductory calls with, particularly colleagues who we work with really closely at the NEU at the University of Melbourne, and learning a lot more about upcoming research, upcoming treatments that we might be interested in, because that's how we better support the community, by knowing what's coming up. The other thing that we haven't really touched on is, again, if you go to these types of conferences, they're poster presentations where people who didn't quite make it into the actual presentations in a conference room will present a big A1 poster of their research findings. There were over 1,000 of these different posters to go and look at, as well as all of the different presentations with all of their sub-presentations. So again, just showing, I mean, actually, although it was overwhelming, I think that's a really positive message about the sheer number of people who are involved in research and clinical trials and treatments for MS. You know, we do complain about the lack of investment, the lack of funding. There always needs to be more, but actually, in order to be able to have an annual conference, there is that volume of content, I think, is phenomenal in itself.
Definitely. So it was definitely worth the trip to Milan and the baptism of fire.
I needed a lot of sleep afterwards. It was absolutely shattering, but it was brilliant. I felt really,
in the best way.
Really engaged, yeah. A great group of people, and some really, really exciting, positive things coming out of it, most of which Brett's covered, which is, yeah, fantastic.
Brilliant. And it's great that Overcoming MS had a seat at that particularly large table. Definitely. Well, thank you, Alex, and again, welcome to the webinar. Thanks for being here. So we've had lots of questions. We've had some pre-submitted ones and some live questions as well to go through. So essentially, Brett, if I put the questions forward to you to answer, and then Alex, you can comment where possible based on your experience. How does that sound? Is that okay?
Yep, works for me.
Brilliant. Brilliant. And just as a disclaimer, I am not a medical professional in any sense, so apologies for my pronunciation in advance. So Brett, the first question: during ECTRIMS, an article on the results of a vidofludimus calcium was published. This appears to give some hope of nerve damage reduction rather than the swathe of anti-inflammatory drugs targeting relapse reduction. This person has said, I would appreciate Brett's thoughts on vidofludimus calcium and what might be a timeline for this treatment to be available in the UK if all trials and approvals are progressed satisfactorily.
Yep. So this is where you're going to get annoyed at me, because I could have told you beforehand that actually we call it IMU 838, which might have been easier for you to say than the long name. So I didn't actually get to I think it was a poster presentation around this at the conference. I didn't get to see it, but I've sort of followed it up since then. So yeah, it's certainly an interesting new option that's coming out, and what's particularly interesting about it from some of the data that they have, and goes back to the slide I was showing just before around PIRA, is that there's some evidence to suggest that this treatment, oh, sorry, just getting my feedback coming through. I don't know if anyone else can hear me echoed.
No,
yeah, it's echoing.
Okay. No, it's gone now. Targets both that inflammatory component that we were talking about, but also that neurodegenerative component. So I think that's particularly interesting. Obviously, I said that there's nothing that works against that neurodegeneration. What's also important with this new treatment is that they're looking both at relapsing remitting MS and progressive MS, and have seen some positive results from both. I think it's slightly interesting in terms of the data that they've presented around how they're monitoring it, and really it's just around that biomarker that I talked about, neurofilament light. So I think there's probably a little bit more that we need to know. But the relapsing remitting is in sort of phase 3 trials at the moment. Progressive is in phase 2. So, you know, it's something that if we do see positive results across that phase 3 trial, then, you know, that's the big step to then getting something approved into the market. So I still think there's a way to go with it. I think there's more data that we need to see, but it's certainly promising and certainly interesting. But it's probably, you know, still a few years away. But, you know, we'll certainly monitor that. That's something that I hope we get further updates on at next year's meeting.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Brett. So the next question, somebody has asked, were there any discussions on COVID-19 and MS at the conference? Is COVID being investigated as a possible trigger for MS, as long COVID appears to have similar symptoms to MS?
Yeah, excellent question. So there was still some discussion of COVID at this year's meeting, probably less than at previous meetings, but still some stuff there. And I think probably the main presentation that I saw around that was some really impressive data that used some global registries, global databases that have information from many people living with MS around the world. And it did quite clearly show that infection with COVID-19 did increase the risk of a person living with MS having a relapse. So while we know that there's a lot of data now showing that the actual risk for people living with MS, if they do become infected with COVID, isn't necessarily worse than the general population. So other than there's some slight data showing that some of the B-cell therapies may increase that risk slightly, but generally what we've found is that the risk of, you know, serious outcomes, hospitalization, requiring ventilation, death isn't different necessarily between people living with MS and the general population. I guess what we need to be aware of in terms of, you know, potential outcomes of that is that it does increase the risk of a relapse, and so some worsening disease activity. So that was, I think, important, especially when I think globally, and there's obviously reasons for this, we're trying to move on from the pandemic, and a lot of people would say that it's, you know, the pandemic doesn't exist anymore. I wouldn't be one of those people, but I think it's a nice time to sort of reiterate that message for people living with MS of, you know, it's still something to be mindful of. Now, it's not something that necessarily needs to run our lives and govern our lives, but, you know, those lessons that we learned in the height of the pandemic around hand hygiene, being careful about areas to go to, are things that we should continue to try and reiterate for that. In terms of the second part of the question, is it being investigated as a trigger? Yes and no. I think there's some interest in terms of long COVID, definitely, and what that might look like. And there's certainly some neurological symptoms that seem to be present in some people. Long COVID is such a mystery still to everyone that it's hard to really get anything about. There was some talk around potential triggers, but it hasn't really been seen as being at anything that's been looked at has sort of said probably coincidental in terms of just timing. It's very hard at any point to say that, you know, this was the cause. More likely, anyone who's sort of had in COVID-19 infection and then developed MS, they probably would have developed MS anyway. It was just, you know, coincidental that the COVID-19 infection happened first. But yeah, really good question.
Okay, so coincidental then, right. So you touched just then on your answer about, I think you said global databases. This next question has been asked says, did the conference address more general global perspectives on MS, considering the diverse nature of the condition and its impact worldwide?
Yeah, again, another excellent question. So yes, I mean, one of the nice things, as Alex said, is that there's so many people in the room coming from so many different parts of the world, that, you know, almost as a nature of that, we're having those discussions without even necessarily needing to place a focus on those discussions, because it does bring everyone together, and so they can share their experiences. And I think it's very clear that the experiences do differ in some aspects depending on where you're coming from. There was a session devoted entirely to that, and a session around global perspectives where we had representatives from each of the key regions, so as well as ECTRIMS and ACTRIMS, which we've talked about being European and American. There's also LACTRIMS, which is Latin America, PACTRIMS, which is the Asia Pacific region, and ACTRIMS, which is the Middle East. And so they all presented around a key issue that's affecting their region at the moment. So yes, though I would say that I still think diversity is something we can do better at in MS research, but I do think that's something that's being acknowledged, and that we are at least now having conversations about around how there needs to be improved diversity in things like clinical trials, to make sure that anything that we're seeing is appropriate for, or understanding who it is and isn't appropriate for. So yes, the conversations are happening. We still need more of them. But we are working towards that.
Okay.
Did you go to any of the presentations? I'm racking my brain trying to think which one it was, but there was definitely some trial results. But of course, one of the things for different studies globally is the vitamin D and the sunlight. And there was one trial that had been conducted, but I think in Finland, and looking at the impact on sunlight, and it was I think it must have been within the healthy living presentations, and of course that then does vary across the globe and makes it quite difficult, I guess, to compare different trial results in different places, because if there is a geographical spread of MS caused by that, that's going to obviously impact on your control groups.
Yeah, definitely. So I didn't sit in on that presentation, but it's something that we've been discussing for a while. The most interesting thing around that latitude shift that we see. So yeah, the closer you live to the equator, the more protected you are from developing MS, seems to be the case. Though interestingly, it's really only where you are for about the first 10 years of your life. So if you live near the equator until you're 20 and then move down to Tasmania or up to, you know, Norway or anything like that, you'll have that same low risk that you have. But yeah, it's certainly something that needs to be kept in mind when doing any of these sort of things, the different environmental factors that people experience. And, you know, there was some interesting data presented around exposure to things like weed killers and how they may increase risk of developing MS. So, you know, trying to, when we're doing all of this research, trying to account for all of those different factors around geographic locations, genetics, environmental exposures. You know, sex is a really obvious one. We know that there's a female-male difference in terms of MS. Is one of the difficulties around this, and something that we do really need to be mindful of.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks both. Next question. During the conference, were there differing views about the application of the research, or differing opinions on which research was more important?
I mean, Alex, you might have a thought on this as well, but I would say yes. I don't think you can get that many scientists in a room and have them all agree on anything. They tend to.
I was going to say exactly the same.
Tend to have very strong views on what they believe is right. But I think that's a real benefit of having the conference, is that these discussions and those disagreements and those, you know, challenging of opinions all happens at the meeting. And there are sessions that are set up that are, you know, set up as debates where they take, you know, a pretty hot topic. And one of them this year was around the, you know, whether or not hormone replacement therapy should be something that we use as standard in women living with MS when they go through menopause. And so, you know, we had both sides of that debate get in a room and essentially argue their points. So I would say almost any topic that we present about, there's some level of disagreement. You know, the induction escalation approach, that's something that's been debated for a long time. I'd say now we're getting close to consensus on it, but you know, it's probably still not 100%. Lifestyle modifications is another good one. And when I was talking to Alex before this, I mean, we were sort of saying that 5 years ago, it was something where you know, a lot of healthcare professionals wouldn't necessarily buy into a discussion around lifestyle modifications. Whereas now I'd say we're getting close to, I would say there's a consensus around the fact that we know that this is an important thing for people living with MS to do. Now, people will have disagreements around exactly what the best approaches are, how much we should be talking about it. But yeah, I think we move between those things. And while I say there's consensus now, that may change by next year. It's part of the interesting part of the meeting.
And it's also because trial results will impact that, because you'll get a trial that suggests that findings are going in that direction, and then there'll be a big trial that say actually that the trial found out that there wasn't an impact of that particular drug or that particular direction of treatment. So it's also, it changes regularly depending on outcomes of new trials every time they're announced. And of course, you know, I said before, funding is limited. There are loads of trials going on. There's loads of research going on, but all of these different researchers and clinicians are competing for the same very limited pot of funding. So everyone is trying to say that their research is the most important because that's going to get them the funding. So there's an element of self-promotion through necessity, I think, there.
Yeah, 100%. Couldn't agree more.
Definitely. So next question, how were patient perspectives and experiences incorporated into the discussions at the conference this year?
Yeah, really good question, really important question. Obviously, with my background with MStranslate, it's something that I'm very passionate about ensuring that we have. I think for both directions of that conversation, I think it's obviously really important to keep people living with MS engaged in the research space and understanding what's going on. Reasons for doing webinars like this, which is why I think it's fantastic that Overcoming MS has the webinars like this to continue to provide this information. But also going back the other way, I think it's really important for researchers to be able to get the lived experience of people living with MS to help guide their research, to make sure that the research that we're doing is appropriate, is meeting the questions and providing the answers that the MS community needs. So really, I mean, while the conference is open to anyone to attend, the majority, as Alex sort of saying, of the 3 days of the research are pretty high level and wouldn't necessarily be super beneficial without the science background. But as of 2022, and it ran again in 2023, there is an extra day now at the end of the conference that's specifically designed for the MS community to come and hear about updates on that. So that was great. It's been a great initiative. It obviously really aligns with what I'm interested in. I think that will continue to develop. And I do think starting to incorporate it more and more across the 3 days would also be great, to have that sort of experience within certain sessions in the meeting as well, so that more and more of the researchers can hear that. So it is something that's starting to shift, which is really positive, but something that I'd like to see grow more and more.
Brilliant, thank you. We've still got quite a lot of questions to go through. They just keep coming in. So I know we spoke before, you're both happy to sort of stay on and have more of a discussion, which is great. So we might, just for our audience, we might run over slightly. But the next question was the use of Mavenclad or cladribine, a DMT, used for relapsing MS discussed at the conference, or do you have any awareness of research around this?
So yeah, there was some updates, none that I was able to sit in sessions on, but it's certainly something that was being discussed. There's some updated data, and actually some updated data that I've seen recently as well. So cladribine or Mavenclad has been something that's sort of come into the MS treatment landscape recently. It's approved in most places around the world now. Differing in terms of its treatment approach. So it's an oral therapy that only requires sort of minimal treatment across a couple of years. So less sort of treatment intensive than, say, some of the other therapies where people need to come in for infusions and things like that. Again, it focuses around sort of modulating the immune response. So it's working on sort of decreasing that inflammation, the same as others, even though it's in a slightly different mechanism. But the data from it has shown that it can be a really effective therapy for for a lot of people living with MS, it's certainly a good addition to the treatment landscape. It's beneficial for some people, probably sits slightly below some of the highly effective therapies that we have in terms of some of the latest data that's come out. Although, in terms of statistically, it sits slightly below. In terms of clinically meaningful, some of the data we've seen is that it's, could be one more relapse every 20 years or something like that.
Yeah.
So it's a good treatment option, but obviously for anyone in terms of thinking about treatment options, that's a discussion to have with, your neurologist and your healthcare professional. That's not something I can talk about, but it's certainly a treatment that's available in most parts of the world and has shown some really promising data and continued to show that beyond trials when it's been used in the real world.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Brett. Next question. I have a mother that had MS. 3 out of 5 of her children, myself included, are living with MS. Is there a study that would be relevant or could include our circumstances in their analysis that you know of?
Yes. So there's definitely one happening in Hobart that's specifically related to that. Now, Hobart might be a little bit far away from where this person's based. But so there is and there will be other family studies. That's just the one that I know about. So yeah, there's a specific family study that I was hearing about just the other day. And this person wants to send me an email. I can connect them with the study because I don't have the details on, but I know the researcher that's sort of running that study, where they are looking at exactly that. So obviously at the very beginning of my presentation, I showed the information around genetics and what we know around that. That's looking at MS in general. But so this study is looking more at, is there a difference in genetics when we look specifically at families with really high incidences of MS to see, is there, any different genes just looking in those families that may explain why there seems to be, these families where we have multiple members across generations that have it. So yeah, that would be the one that I know of off the top of my head. There's probably others going around similarly around the world, but yeah, that's the one that I'm aware of. And as I said, they can feel free to flick me an email and I can connect them with that research.
Your email
might be
address
worth
is
Sorry, it might be worth a look at, if they're UK based, it might be worth a look at the MS Register website as well. And sort of, yes, they might have some connections with different trials along those angles.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Great idea. And your email address is on your presentation slides as well, isn't it?
It's on the last slide. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay. How do you feel about a bit of a quick fire Q&A for the next couple of questions just to get through them? Is that okay? Brilliant.
I think that's a subtle hint to keep my answers shorter and not talk so much.
Not at all. So first question, did you attend/hear of any portions of the conference where CART research specific to MS was addressed?
No, I didn't. It's an interesting area. I think there's still a lot we need to know about it. It's quite a new approach. It's being used a lot more in cancer, but there could certainly be a role in MS. But it's something we need to see more about. It's pretty early stage.
Okay,
Is that better?
Brilliant. It's great. Are there remyelination studies regarding metformin and intermittent fasting being done individually or simultaneously in combination?
So metformin individually, so the Cambridge trial at the moment is just looking at metformin in combination with clemastine. There's nothing using fasting at the moment, though I do know that the Cambridge group are interested in running a separate trial at some point looking at intermittent fasting. The reason why they started with metformin was just feedback that they got from people there in their sort of treatment group who were going to be the ones participating in the trial to suggest that that was going to be something that they were more willing to do than necessarily a fasting approach where, I guess that can be more difficult for some people, but there is plans to do that in the future.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Are there any drugs in the future for progressive MS that we should keep an eye on? This person says they have primary progressive MS, so they're really hoping that there is something coming in the future.
So yeah, I mean, the big thing that I would say on this is that there is a lot more focus now on progressive MS. We have the International Progressive MS Alliance. There are different groups now who are solely focused on making sure that we get treatment options for progressive MS. In terms of specific ones, that are in the pipeline. I mean, IMU 383, I think was the numbers. I'll get confused with that, but the vidofludimus calcium is doing a progressive MS trial. There are others looking at it, but nothing that I know that's sort of in late stages at the moment. But
Okay.
yeah, it's something we'll certainly keep an eye on.
Okay. Was there also a session on the caliper study to a medicine for hopefully secondary progressive MS?
Yeah, so this is believe caliper was or is related to that calcium, the IMU 383 calcium study. So yeah, there was some stuff presented on that as well, I think, at the meeting, or I've seen some stuff on that recently. Similarly, so it's an earlier stage to the relapsing remitting trial. Similarly, they've seen some benefits in the progressive people, but that's at a very early stage, and we need to see more on that before really understanding exactly what it looks like. But it's so far been interesting and potentially useful.
Okay, brilliant. So Alex, this question for you, and also for Brett. What was your biggest takeaway / insight from the conference? So I know you explained obviously about your experience, but what did you personally take away from it?
I think, well, the overall theme of the event was smouldering MS. So that was sort of well advertised. It was I can say post-event, it was the password for the Wi-Fi. So there was lots of talk of smouldering MS. And I think, as I said, I'm relatively new into this role, and it wasn't something that I was that aware of before. So definitely something to keep an eye on in terms of where that goes. I think there is the joy and the frustration of seeing a lot of these posters and a lot of the presentations is when trials are looking really, really promising, and then they go into the next stage of the trial and it doesn't quite deliver what it should do. So there's a lot of stuff, I think, around the remyelination, I think, could be absolutely phenomenal in terms of the impact on the MS community. And it sounds from what you're saying, Brett, that really does show a positive hope of that happening. And I think an awful lot seems to be, we all know MS is so individual for everybody, and therefore the treatments and the medication that's available needs to be really individual. So I think a lot of things coming out around it works for this group, but it doesn't work for this group, or it might work for somebody who has this particular gene, but not this gene. So that whole direction of personalized, individualized medicine, I think, could be really fascinating. But it all comes down to whether the trials deliver the right results.
Brilliant. And you, Brett, what would you say your biggest takeaway would be?
I mean, at a very broad level, I think the biggest takeaway is just around how much research is being done into MS and into so many different areas. I think for me, this is now my 5th or 6th ECTRIMS actually attending, and then, a number that I followed before that. But the shift in terms of what we're talking about as well, and the broader topics that we're looking into, I think is something that is probably a testament to the MS community being quite vocal about what they're looking for. At 2018, when I was in Berlin at this conference, symptomatic management, lifestyle modifications weren't something that we were hugely talking about. It was a lot more around, basic science, understanding disease mechanisms, talking about new treatments. Whereas now, it's basically a guarantee that there will be sessions on diet, sessions on exercise, sessions on symptomatic management. And I think that's, an understanding from the research community that while a lot of the things that we're talking about are really important to improve long-term goals here in MS, we've sort of heard loud and clear from people living with MS that while that's great and they are very excited and very supportive of that, they also want things that can help them sooner and help them take control of their MS and help them on a daily basis sort of manage what they're going through. And that's, why we see things now, lots of talks around how can we improve fatigue. That's understanding that fatigue is one of the biggest debilitating factors that people living with MS experience. And so while we might try and come up with better therapies to, slow disease progression or repair damage, at the same time, we need to be thinking about how can we, make this so that people living with MS can reduce their fatigue and have a better quality of life. And so I think, that's a takeaway for me, as well as all of the stuff that that Alex said. I mean, they were all really key themes, and you sort of always walk away from these meetings as exhausted as you are, having spent 3 days running around a huge conference venue, trying to see as many talks as you can. There is almost always that initial excitement already of, I can't wait for next year. And I really want to see what happens in the next 12 months, because there is so much happening and so many developments that while 12 months doesn't seem like, you know, a huge period of time, you know, major updates can happen in that length of time.
Definitely. And that sort of brings us to our very final question of today. So you just talked about future treatment. This last question from somebody has said, looking ahead, based on the discussions at this year's conference, what would you personally see as the most promising developments in MS research, and how could this affect future treatments?
You want to jump in on that one first, Alex, or?
I'm now excited from what you said about remyelination, because I've had so many conversations with people about remyelination, and I think the conversations about prevention, I think, are really interesting, and vaccines, and that's sort of, you know, new onto the cards, and I think, or relatively new onto the cards, and I think it sounds as though it's still a long way away, but again, that could be transformational at some point in the future. So I think there's definitely hope, I think, out there around the advances in treatments and medicine, and I think that's probably my takeaway, is that it doesn't, I think in some conditions it can feel a little bit static, and actually everything kind of goes through plateau times, don't they? But at the moment I feel we're very much on an upwards trajectory of positivity, which I think is absolutely necessary and well overdue.
Yeah, and I'd probably agree with, I mean, myelin repair, I think, is the next, for me, myelin repair is the next big thing. I think, you know, we've made really good advances in terms of the current treatments that we have to try and slow disease progression. You know, getting more options in that space is always beneficial, because we know that not everyone will respond to every treatment, but, you know, I think we're getting to a point where we won't see huge advances. HSCT is an interesting thing, and we haven't discussed that at all yet. But how that fits in, I think, will be interesting. But, you know, moving to that next stage of being able to repair damage, I think will be huge. And I think we are in a window at the moment where there are a lot of trials coming on. So it's something that, you know, within the next 12 months, I hope to see more and more data on that, hopefully positive data. And yeah, basically everything in the space, I think. I mean, you know, I'm kind of biased that everything is exciting, because I think everything tells us something. You know, even negative results tell us things, as frustrating as they are. And so, you know, coming to see that. And the other thing that I would mention last off is starting to see some stuff coming out of Octopus, which is something that in the UK you will have heard a bit about. So this is the new multi-arm, multi-stage trial that Australia has also just launched their version of it, called Platypus. So we've got Octopus and Platypus now running, where basically you know, with the way it's being set up, we're going to be able to trial new therapies much more quickly and at the same time to try and accelerate these sort of discoveries. So starting to see some of the outcomes of using that approach, I think, will also be interesting.
Brilliant, thank you. I think that was a great question to end our webinar on. I feel like this last hour has completely flown by. So yeah, just a massive thank you to both of you. It's been a pleasure to have you on our webinar, sharing your thoughts, and for taking the time to be with us. And yeah, we hope to have you on another webinar soon. Maybe we can lock you in for next year.
100% more than happy to do
it. Brilliant, thank you. Well, I'll just finish off the webinar with some closing remarks. But yeah, just a massive thank you to Brett and Alex for presenting today, sharing their experiences of this year's ACTRIMS conference. And also a big thank you to my colleague Sean, who has been working in the background, helping with all of your questions. Hopefully you've enjoyed this session, and just as a reminder, you will all receive a link to access the recording via Zoom next week, and you'll also be able to access Brett's presentation, the webinar highlights, and the transcript as well. But that concludes our 2023 webinar season. So a massive thank you to all of our special guests and our viewers at home who have joined us for a really, really successful webinar year. We will be taking a short break over the holiday season, and we will be back in February next year for a very exciting brand new webinar season. So please do check our social media pages and the Overcoming MS website for more details soon. And I think that's all that's left for me to say is we wish you all a happy holidays and we hope to see you in the new year. So thanks everyone. Bye-bye.